I'm drawing on two projects, two ongoing projects studying data infrastructure in the natural sciences, and talking about these ideas of fracture and reconciliation in those infrastructures. So by fracture, I mean the breaking apart and breaking off of small subsets of natural science knowledge infrastructure, and often to maintain it, to change it, to fix it, to update it, things like that. And by reconciliation, I mean the eventual reintegration of those broken off pieces into some sort of whole. And through these case studies, we've started working through this idea of semantic refactoring as one of the ways that facilitates this breaking apart and putting back together. So that's the process of revising something like a controlled vocabulary or a classification structure in response to changing norms or needs. So I'm going to talk through these concepts through, first, I want to give you a little bit of a crash course in what deep time is and a little bit about like what the natural sciences are about for those that aren't familiar. And then work through this through two case studies, one of migration of data infrastructures in biological taxonomies and another of that in natural science databases, basically collection management systems in natural history museums. And then hopefully try to synthesize those together. Okay, to start off, a little bit about the natural sciences in general and what it means to try to construct deep time. So this concept of deep time that I talked about in the abstract, some of this is a little bit of a cheat because I just think it's a super interesting concept and I enjoy finding an excuse to talk about it. But I think it also winds up being important in thinking about long-term infrastructure, which I'll hopefully get to by the end of this talk. But this concept of deep time is extremely foundational in the natural sciences, so fields like evolutionary biology and geology. It was coined originally by James Hutton, who is a geologist, who writes in a really important book, Theory of Earth. We have the satisfaction to find that in nature there is wisdom, system, and consistency. For having in the natural history of this earth seen a succession of worlds, we may from this conclude that there's a system in nature. So what he's saying there is that through observing the layers of rock that we can see in mountains, we can understand that there have been many versions of the world through time. So he's talking about stratigraphy as evidence of a very, very old earth. And more than 6,000 years old, and as was the prevailing thought at the time, or thousands of years old. It's so old that we cannot hold the age of the earth in our heads. And then he says, the result, therefore, of this physical inquiry, so the inquiry of the rocks, that we find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end to the earth. So some of you from a certain cultural background may recognize that as being from a Bad Religion song, because the lead singer of the band Bad Religion, Greg Graffin, is an evolutionary biologist. But it's also like, it's this really poetic expression of how Hutton has, what he's found is like, it is a world that is larger than our previous conceptions of the world. And it's this very revolutionary concept. And so one of the primary goals of the natural sciences since 1788 has been to map out the progression of that world, to try to figure out the history of our Earth in that very, very large breadth of time. So the way we do that kind of unpacking and constructing of deep time is through a couple of different kinds of data structures, we might think of them, which I've summarized as like timelines, taxonomies, and trees. So we do a lot of looking at the Earth's stratigraphy to try to figure out the ordering of different epochs over time, and thinking about the ordering of different animals in those eras over time. So looking at the fossils to try to see what came first and how things evolved. For people interested in biology, they also do a lot of construction of taxonomies, meaning catalogs of different, basically trying to list out all of the different organisms that have ever lived on this planet and place them into categories. Originally, some of this is for information retrieval so that we can better look up information about these organisms. But some of it's also about trying to figure out the true relatedness of these creatures. So what evolved from what, how did things change over time, and what might have inspired those changes. One of the most interesting things about this, though, we often see figures like this and assume that we have a lot of this figured out. So most of the general periods of the Earth's geologic history haven't changed too dramatically. And most of us can list off different kinds of kingdoms of organisms like animals, plants, things like that. But in reality, all of these systems of knowing about the Earth are still evolving and still being changed and are still being worked on by different researchers working in the natural sciences. So there's still actually a lot of debate around how you would divide up different parts of the geologic timescale. One that you might be familiar with is debates about how we are defining the current epoch that we're in. Is it the Anthropocene, as defined by the start at which we can see man's or humankind's mark on the geologic layers of our Earth? Or is it some other marker? So this is actually something that's still being contested in geology. As far as taxonomy, our classification schemes get reworked all the time as we find new fossils and new evidence and new information about the organisms in our world. And even for these phylogenetic trees, so taxonomies are kind of like more about the classification of things, how are we naming things. Phylogenies are a little bit more about what's the relationship between these and what are the main branches of life as things actually evolved. There have been major and revolutionary changes to even these fundamental categories of life, like moving from just 2 domains of life into 3 domains, even just in the last few decades. So all of this work here of trying to figure out the history of the world is still very much going on and is still very much a live science. A lot of this stuff is a lot less settled than we might think by looking at nice figures or simple timelines or something like that. I wanted to dive deep into one example of these. So the phylogenetic community is one that's really working hard to try to come up with, like, there's this great dream of coming up with a tree of life, basically. If we collect enough genetic data, compare it all together, we should be able to come up with like a canonical representation of how life on Earth actually evolved. And often when these sorts of, so there's been a couple of projects about these over the years. And this is from a press release describing one, which is it's the Tree of Life project. So the headline of this says, first comprehensive tree of life shows how you are related to millions of species. However, if you dive into more of the actual article about this, you find that there's a whole lot of caveats to this supposedly canonical tree of life that's being represented. The first one is, well, there's no single database of accepted names for all of these species. So the group had to come up with some names for some of them, for one thing. Then they started to say, we know that the tree is a step forward, but it doesn't even summarize what we know. So it's not even comprehensive of what we know in the world, let alone comprehensive of what is in the world. And then on top of it, we hope that the tree looks much different a year from now. So this is something that they're still working on. So part of this, like, there's some tension here between who's writing the headline of this press release or pop science article that's representing this scientific study, of course. But it's also showing, like, I think it's showing some tension around how we want to be certain about this knowledge while this knowledge is still evolving and being contributed to and basically being constructed by the group of people that are working on it. So it's a knowledge infrastructure that's still developing and is still being worked on, basically. Okay, so this is the universe of natural science data that we're trying to think about for these 2 cases. And what I'm interested in is how are these infrastructures changing? How are they being maintained? How are they being contributed to? So I'm going to talk through 2 case studies now in which we started diving into how these are fracturing and changing and getting reconciled back together. The first one is through a project that I started working on in grad school and then have been continuing to write up over the last couple of years called the Transforming Taxonomic Interfaces Project. So that science of biological taxonomy, basically the science of naming and describing different kinds of organisms. It's a very much analog sort of thing. So this picture right here is basically a taxonomic interface. So taxonomists would sit in this chair, and yes, they use a computer sometimes, but often they're staring at their specimens that are just off at arm's reach, working through a microscope and drawing on often paper materials because most of the taxonomic literature has not been suitably digitized to the point where they could just live in a totally digital sort of world. The PIs of this project were Matt Yoder, who's actually a taxonomist himself and works at the Illinois Natural History Survey, and Mike Twydale, who's a CSCW researcher and professor at University of Illinois. And our goal with this project was to study taxonomic data practices to build them better digital interfaces. Taxonomy is facing its own data deluge, and there's a lot of reasons that people want to do what they can to build better systems for them to share and process their data. But the big obstacle to it is all of these analog little bits that they need to work with, as well as just this massive amount of information that they need to process. Excuse me. So in this project, we wanted to kind of mix our methods to both understand the data practices and to do some design work. So it involved a bunch of some qualitative methods, including site visits and interviews with 34 taxonomists, and also some participatory design. So working with people to do prototyping of different kinds of systems that they might want to work with, and design hackathons to actually start working towards building those. What I'm talking about here is mostly what's emerged out of the qualitative work that we did, which was basically we tried to work towards a rich description of taxonomic data practices, which I'm going to walk through over the next couple of slides. So taxonomic work historically has two important outputs. The first one is a species description, which is basically, it's a semi-structured description of an organism. So so this one here is describing a particular kind of wasp. Technically, most of these words are English, but a lot of them have roots in Latin, or it's just extremely specific jargon that's useful for describing these very specific kinds of animals. I say that it's semi-structured because many of these descriptions are actually written in a relatively standardized way. Like there are best practices for how you actually describe these organisms, but it's by no means machine readable. And one of the great dreams of a lot of the current taxonomic community members is to actually get this to the point where it could be machine readable. So you could get computers to help you with creating these sorts of descriptions. So that's one kind of important output. The second kind of important output is this much more machine readable product, a character matrix. So basically it's a table listing out all of the characteristics of the different kinds of a given organism that make it different from other organisms. So the example I have here is a very high level one. How would you tell the difference between a lion and a platypus? Well, a lion has 5 fingers, has fur, but it does not lay eggs, whereas a platypus does. But imagine that for something like this tiny parasitic wasp that we have to the left. So a lot of the people that we were working with were entomologists who study these hyperdiverse orders of wasps. There's literally millions of different kinds of wasps that are about 2 millimeters wide. You need an extremely detailed character matrix in order to start telling those sorts of organisms apart from each other. So that's one of the most important bits of data that gets created by taxonomists. Another important thing to note here is that of these two important kinds of outputs, these days, a lot of the descriptions and matrices that are being published are revisions of older work. So it's people going back to resurvey a kind of organism that had been surveyed before, maybe 100 years before, 200, or even sometimes 10, depending on what people are working on. And they're revising this earlier work to update things with new findings, or because they disagree with the description or the classification that was made by the person who had done them before. So there's this huge increase of people basically revising prior classifications and descriptions. Through our qualitative research, we found that these workflows, the workflows to create these descriptions are extremely iterative. And despite the fact that this is a science and they're all very, they want their results to be objective and repeatable. A lot of their work is quite qualitative, which is like a huge tension within the field, because it's really hard to make a qualitative observation immediately repeatable by somebody else. So just a couple of quotes from our participants about this. I do a minimum of 2 or 3 passes for specimens to start grouping them into things. I go through the same process again and again. You reassess the characters, you have to go back and look at it again. Sometimes in reading literature, you find another author described something you didn't see, you have to go back over and over again. So a lot of the process of revising these sorts of taxonomy means just going over their data again and again and trying to come up with a very reproducible sort of qualitative characterization of things. A lot of them described continually running into what we could call the vocabulary problem, which is as you saw in that description of the WASP in the first example, a lot of the terminology in this field is rooted in Latin. However, most people these days do not speak Latin. And there's been a huge issue in training younger taxonomists to use this totally foreign terminology that largely is only used in the context of taxonomy. So more and more people are pushing to use less standardized references and getting away from botanical Latin and things like that. But the worry is that the more easily understood terms are going to be less precise. Okay, and finally, I said before that a lot of the work that they're doing is focused on revising these descriptions and these matrices. What's important to understand about the matrices is that in revising them, they're not just revising just something about one organism. They're really revising an entire classification system, which is something that is really complex and really challenging and also really interesting about the field. So there's been a lot of work being done around, so this diagram is showing the comparison of two different taxonomies, basically two approaches to classifying the same group of things, and thinking about how you might reconcile differences between those taxonomies and represent differences between those taxonomies. And this has become a big, there's so much work going on that it basically everybody's revising multiple taxonomies at the same time. The worry then becomes that we're not going to be able to get to a reconciled one that actually accommodates what everybody has published recently, basically. I'm gonna skip over that, I think. Okay, so through this case study, we developed this idea of semantic refactoring as being key to taxonomic work. So we define this as the process of revising a controlled vocabulary or a classification structure in response to changing norms or user needs. And we see this as depending on two forms of articulation work. So articulation as in defining, so clearly and expressing and describing a concept. So in this case, it might be clearly expressing and describing a particular character within, or like an anatomical feature in some sort of organism, or clearly describing the relationship between two organisms. And it also entails articulation as in jointing together, which is placing those concepts in an existing hierarchy or structure. So thinking about how your taxonomy winds up interlocking with somebody else's taxonomy, and doing the work to try to bring those two things together. And so we take this phrase, semantic refactoring, from this has been used in some database literature before. So prior authors have talked about it as being like the piecemeal practice of making semantic representations and structures clearer. So similar to refactoring code though, but you're refactoring a classification system, so. Okay. All right, so so that's the conclusion of this first case study. We basically found that like these biological taxonomies are indeed changing over time, and a lot of it's being done through this piecemeal sort of process, which, like I said, it's not perfect. People don't magically think about how they're integrating their particular projects into a giant whole, but it's still functioning well enough to keep the science of taxonomy alive and productive, and people feel confident about the sort of work that they're doing. I want to contrast this with my second case study, which is looking at the migration and sometimes the lack of migration of natural history museum databases. So again, and so this right here, this picture, I said I was going to talk about, like, get back to the tar pits, which wound up getting me into information science. It is this specific computer that wound up getting me into information science, which I'll talk through in just a second. But first, I want to talk about how natural history museums relate to biological taxonomy. And the way we can kind of, I want to put natural history museums and their data infrastructures forward as, we might think of them as the infrastructure underlying the infrastructure. So biological taxonomies are, one way of thinking about those is that they're the conceptual infrastructure of our understanding of the world. They're basically this giant knowledge base mapping out what organisms are in the world and how they're related. The way that people build up that infrastructure relies on this other infrastructure of natural history museums and their specimens and their databases. So in order to describe a group of organisms, you first need to gather together examples of those organisms, all of which are stored in places like these natural history museums. There's an estimated, I think it's 2 billion specimens in natural history museums all across the globe. Many of these collections are extremely long-lived, sometimes some of them over 300 years old. And they're a completely critical and irreplaceable record of life on Earth. It is indeed a little bit grim. So in the second picture here, you're looking at some bird collections at the Smithsonian, and those are indeed a whole bunch of dead birds. However, these physical specimens are irreplaceable if you want to do things like molecular studies, study changes to morphology or like the animal's shape over time, and do other sorts of studies that we haven't even thought of yet about like environmental and ecological change. So these collections are what are necessary in order to build, so this infrastructure is necessary to build that other taxonomic infrastructure on top of. Further complicating this layering though is the fact that we now have layers of computational infrastructure on top of the specimen infrastructure. So I've kind of displayed these as if this is a sort of progression from like cabinets of curiosity in the Victorian times to on the right, I have a bunch of logos from different kinds of data sharing platforms for the biodiversity universe. The most known, well-known one is probably GBIF, where lots of museums share their data, basically small records describing the individual organisms and specimens that are in their collections. But it's not at all a progression, actually. It's that all of these layers are existing at the same time and interacting with each other at the same time, which is, and persisting over long periods of time, which can be extremely challenging to navigate. Okay. So taxonomies, we know those change over time through the semantic refactoring and revision. The thing that sent me to grad school is thinking about how our data systems are changing over time and why aren't they? So in 2008, like I said, this is what got me thinking about information science, because my boss was still using this same computer with the blue screen background, MS-DOS, and obsessed with WordPerfect 3.1 to enter in all of his field notes. And when we asked him about this, his justification was, well, it works fine, and I don't have time to learn anything new. I thought that this could be just like a one-off case, but as I visited more natural history museums and did more research, I started finding more and more examples of these ancient interfaces that were persisting long past the point that they actually should have. Part of this was, this is literally data at risk here. Like my boss's old computer made a scary whirring noise when we would turn it on, and we were actually worried that it would eventually start on fire. And this picture on the right is from my colleague here at Michigan, Christopher Dick, who works in the herbarium at the University of Michigan, who's tweeting, I hope you can see this, but the note on the computer says, save copy of old fungus database on this machine. So this is an old database that was irreplaceable, represents literally thousands of hours of work of people getting data into this that was about to be thrown away until somebody found it. So whereas taxonomy is an example of infrastructures that are changing relatively gracefully, the databases that are underlying the taxonomies are a great example of infrastructures that are not changing as well as we would like them to be. Okay, so this is something that I've started studying a little bit more in earnest through a project that I've still got going on called Migrating Research Data Collections, which has been happily funded by the IMLS. The goal of this project is to better understand the tempo mode and motivating factors underlying research data collection migration, thereby better support this work. I'm also interested in understanding why things aren't migrating as they should be, as is often the case in these natural history museums. I don't want to get too normative and like, you should be using a better system or newer system or something like that. But the real issue is because the data and the infrastructure is actually at risk without migration, why is it that these things aren't being migrated? So we're doing this through the development and comparison of case studies of data and database migration in a number of different fields, but currently focusing on work in different natural history museums throughout the country. For the next, I'm going to present 3 little vignettes from this project right now that are rooted in the pilot work that I did for this, which we published in a paper at ASIST a couple years ago. But just as an illustration of some of the things that we're finding so far, at least in natural history museums. So when talking with collections managers, one of the first things that becomes clear is that most people don't know the full origin of their databases. Most of the databases were actually created long before the current staff started there. That's also why natural history museums are a great place to be doing this work, because many of their data systems are actually, they were early adopters of a lot of database technology. So they have long lives and long histories, many of which have not actually been written down. So in talking with people and developing these case studies, we roughly ask them about 3 states of the database. So what do you know of its past? What state is it in and present? And where do you think it'll be in the future? So at the time of our interview, so this is one example from a university that we've pseudonymized as Mountain University. So in a pretty typical example of the cases that we've been finding here. In the past, these collections were originally paper card catalogs or paper ledgers. At some point, they don't know exactly when, somebody transcribed them and turned them into a FileMaker Pro database. But then the collection manager that did that retired. Nobody knew how to work FileMaker, and everything got turned back into an Excel spreadsheet, and usually multiple Excel spreadsheets. And the hope is that eventually this will get migrated to a fancy new system called Arctos, which will bring everything together, specifically designed for natural history museums, that will make everybody's lives easier. So this is a pretty typical story from one of these places. This is the case from my own former home at the La Brea Tar Pits. In about 1970, they started building this Paradox database. However, all of the people that knew how to work the database retired or gave up with it. So they wound up just exporting it to Excel. Meanwhile, my boss was making all these WordPerfect field notes files, which eventually, and everything stayed in limbo like that for about 30 years until the collection manager that was keeping this ad hoc system running retired. There is an administrative push to consolidate information technology across a family of museums. And this whole, there's this explosion of activity around creating too many spreadsheets, but then a push to eventually integrate them into one system. This, again, Natural History Museum specific system called EMU. So a little bit more diversity in different kinds of data formats here, but still pretty close to the prior example. In the last case here, this was probably the most extreme example of things going a little bit, things getting an unexpectedly diverse information ecology, we'll call it, popping up during an attempted migration. So in the past, this collection was in a paper card catalog. It was digitized at some point, migrated to one system. IT support for that system was sunset. They attempted to migrate it to one particular Natural History Museum specific platform called Specify. That did not go well. And they wound up, this was a highly relational database. And instead of exporting it into one Excel spreadsheet, she wound up exporting every single table in the spreadsheet or in the database into a different Excel file. If you are a person who works with databases, this is an incredibly hard thing to do, and we do not recommend it. It means maintaining all of these unique identifiers by hand. And this is something that this collection manager wound up maintaining by herself, by hand, for up to 5 years, until she eventually was able to work with IT to create this custom Microsoft SQL server to work as their database. So there's a couple of common threads through here. For one thing, it's a lot of attempting to migrate, or for one thing, it's a lot of reactive migration. So migrating your system, changing your infrastructure when you're being forced to, not with any known support. But another common thread here is that a lot of these museums are attempting to adopt some sort of like off-the-shelf system that was allegedly designed just for them, that is often being pushed on them by some sort of administrator. In some cases, this is very successful. Like a lot of the users of Specify and Arctos are very happy with what they've got. But in other cases, there have been examples, including at my former museum, of people just maintaining use of Excel spreadsheets for a long time, but secretly. They do it without telling their IT department. That's and that's just how they get by, because the approved data structure is just not working for their day-to-day lives. And I had one participant, I think, summarize this phenomena really well, saying, so in France, there's this concept of the grand projet, these big projects, they're icons for an institution and icons for senior management. And that's exactly what happened here. Grand projet is really a double-edged word. It means big project, but it also says a lot about the kind of functionality of it. You know, it's symbolic. So these big databases are symbolic more than anything. They don't actually I don't think anybody really thought about their functionality. So they're getting put into systems that are symbolic of being interesting and useful, but are not actually meeting the needs of the users of these systems. So through the taxonomy example, we worked through this idea of semantic refactoring as a way of supporting the reconciliation after you've had to break apart a database in order to fix it, migrate it, clean it, something like that. And we find a similar sort of thing in this case. So as in taxonomies, databases need to be broken apart and semantically refactored to facilitate update and migration. However, like I said, this breaking apart is reactive. It's less intentional. It's something that's being done to survive. And it's usually the nature of these kinds of refactorings wind up being coping mechanisms as opposed to intentional choices to try to participate in a community and become part of an infrastructure once again. So rather than this nice jointing together, we have something that's more like a splint. You're taking emergency action to try to bring something back together. And something that's not going to be nearly as pleasant as if you hadn't broken it in the first place. Okay, so I want to try to synthesize some findings that we're seeing from between these two cases. And returning to this idea of change over time. How did infrastructures change over time, and what exactly is changing in those infrastructures? And I've got three main points that I want to go through. First, I think there's a big difference between proactive and reactive change in infrastructures, and sustainability probably favors the former. So we want to try to move more towards proactive change. Two, deep conceptions of time are as necessary for databases as geology, and I'll unpack that in that slide. And three, I want to talk a little bit against panoptical dreams. And that gets back to what many of you probably have read in what Jeff Bowker has talked about, basically the dream of having a database that represents everything. I think that these cases here are great examples of why we have to fight against those dreams a little bit. So first, proactive versus reactive change. So one of the hardest things with thinking about how to change infrastructure is basically, and this is from Starr and Roulater, infrastructure generally does not want to change. There's great inertia to infrastructure. It's this huge, complex, moving machinery with lots of different parts. But when you are trying to get infrastructure to change, those changes take time and negotiation and adjustment when other aspects of the system are involved. So it involves a lot of people, it involves a lot of work, it involves a lot of careful negotiation. So I think taxonomy is an example of proactive change as being fundamental to the work, and also highly functional change. So people are actually taking the time to do that negotiation and taking the time to do that adjustment. And part of it's that they're given that time because the work of doing these revisions is fundamental to the work of taxonomy. It's acknowledged as being foundational to the field. However, in natural history museums, we have an example of reactive change, so which is generally unexpected or undersupported, and it's often seen as an anomaly. So it's not thought of as a part of normal maintenance or operating. It's something that everybody acts as if it could never have possibly been imagined to happen. And I think thinking about the proactive versus reactive could be a very helpful way of thinking about coping with different kinds of change in infrastructures. And I can see it as being useful in contributing to like ideas around building more sustainable infrastructures and planning for more sustainable infrastructures. From my NHM work, we find some different kinds of factors that lead to these unexpected change. So a lot of it's around staff turnover, whether that's death, retirement, or just moving to a different department. But once you lose that institutional knowledge of how something is functioning, you wind up losing the entire technical infrastructure. So along with it. So it's more than just keeping the database running. You need to keep the organizational forces that keep the database running as well. There's also a lot of unexpected or reactive change that comes from forced obsolescence. So whether that's hardware decay or software versioning. My boss would have been perfectly happy to continue working on his blue screen MS-DOS computer for the remainder of his career. But it literally would have caught on fire. So in that case, he was forced to migrate it whether he wanted to or not. And in a less dramatic sort of way, software versioning is constantly messing with people's databases and data structures. And we even find examples of database software changing the underlying data structure of a system, and therefore rendering something totally unusable because people weren't able to plan for it accordingly. And finally, in the Natural History Museum cases, and I talk about this more in the paper that's associated with this, there's also like a lot of socio-technical conflict. So processes and goals mismatching the processes and goals of the system, basically. So a local workflow doesn't match with the one that's dictated by the database that somebody's being forced to have, and then they're forced to react and build some sort of strange workaround for it. So I think that like these clearly show that one important thing to consider in trying to building more sustainable infrastructure is to think about ways to support proactive rather than reactive change. Because the cost of infrastructural inertia is often just, it means your entire infrastructure might be under threat. So that might be something small like losing a fungus database, although still represents a large amount of work that's gone into that. Or it could be something giant like banking infrastructure and the unemployment claims system of New Jersey. So I was just thinking about this a lot because, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. There have been so many reports about people looking for COBOL programmers, and this is not my area of expertise. And I know that there are people here that are doing research on this, I imagine. And so I think like, but these systems that are running on this very stable technology are a great example of the costs of that stability if you're not taking other steps to keep people trained on that stable system. So the two options here are keep people trained to maintain the old fungus database, or put the work in to migrate those sorts of situations into something newer. Okay. So the second bit of synthesis that I want to do was think about deep time and infrastructure. And for this, I want to go back to Hutton and his poetic way of putting it. The result, therefore, of this physical inquiry is that we find no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end. So thinking about this deep time view of the world, this way of looking at things that are longer and bigger than our normal human ranges of thinking about things. I wanted to first of all point out that like, I know that David Rebus has worked on things like long-term infrastructures. And I think that there's like some nice parallels between like concepts of like the long now of infrastructure. So thinking about an extended period of now in building and designing systems, and these concepts of deep time. And I like thinking of you need to think at a different scale of time, basically, when you're thinking about infrastructural time. And I like the deep time as a way of getting into that. So if we think about how deep time might apply to infrastructure, we do have, as we're interacting with infrastructure, we're not particularly aware of the beginning or end of them a lot of the time. But in our work as maintainers of them or people actually using this, we do become aware of the churn, like the turnover that's happening within these systems. Changes to the data points, changes to the data structures, changes to the hardware and software. I think something that I would like to look into more and to play around more with this geologic metaphor, because I can't help myself, is looking more into the interplay between regular changes, which we're going to call uniformitarian, if there's anybody with any geological background there. So regular changes, so things like updates, regular maintenance, and more paradigm shifting changes. So more catastrophic upheavals, things like emergencies, interruptions, revolutions, being defunded, being shut down, stuff like that. And I like this deep time framework as a way of trying to dive into that. And that's something that I'm hoping to do in future work. Taxonomy gives us some example. So I previously was using taxonomy as an example of like highly functioning semantic refactoring and a successfully migrating infrastructure. I will note though that taxonomists have faced and are continuing to face existential threats of their own. And natural history museums as well, but I'm going to focus on taxonomists just for this. So there have been multiple changes and challenges to the information organization paradigm of taxonomy. One of the more recent ones was this phylocode project, so which was basically arguing that instead of naming the ranks of different classification orders in biological taxonomy, we should instead assign a very convoluted unique identifier to them, which would make it a little bit easier hypothetically to share data and navigate it on the web. So that's one challenge. The second challenge has been the third player of this natural history universe that I mentioned but didn't get into, which is phylogenetic investigations. So using molecular data, comparing genetic data, DNA, to infer the relationships between organisms, rather than using qualitative observations of what things look like or how they're built. So the phylogenetic threat is more of truly a paradigm shift in, and I'm calling it a threat to the taxonomists, not to the world. But phylogeny has truly been like a paradigm shift in biology. So these phylogenetic methods have allowed us to come up with conclusions that we could not really get to using physical specimens and looking at morphology alone. But it also represents a fundamentally different way of organizing data and structuring data and thinking about what counts as good data in this field. Both of these sorts of threats have come up to threaten the sustainability of taxonomy as a profession. So these squiggly line charts from Joppa et al. In 2011, Joppa is a taxonomist himself and was doing basically a little bit of scientometrics on what's going on with taxonomy as a discipline. And what they're finding is that the cumulative number of species being described has leveled off more or less from 1900. So that's in this second to left diagram here. However, the number of taxonomists continues to rise, and the species per taxonomist being described is going down. So we have more taxonomists, but fewer things to describe. And we're potentially running out of work. And so there's been a lot of concern in the field of taxonomy about whether or not this as a field is actually sustainable. And there's also like threat from, they've been having a harder time attracting young taxonomists to the field because they're going to approaches like molecular evolutionary biology as opposed to this more traditional way of studying these organisms. So, I think here you see like there are like, right here we see an example of a potential catastrophic level threat to the field of taxonomy as is being faced by like that infrastructure because of these differing ways of collecting the data and analyzing the data. I hope that made sense. This was like the newest slide and conclusion that I had for this talk, which is why I had a harder time getting through it. Okay. The last little point that I wanted to think about that I think comes out through comparison of these two cases, and I alluded to this at the beginning, I think, thinking about all of the different ways that we can have taxonomies and different ways we can have databases complicates natural history's panoptical dreams. So a lot of folks here are probably familiar with some of the work of Jeff Bowker, and this is a quote from his Memory Practices in the Sciences book, where he has a chapter on biodiversity databasing efforts. And he writes, each particular discipline associated with biodiversity has its own incompletely articulated series of objects. These objects each unfold an organizational history and subtend a particular temporality or spatiality. They frequently are incompletely articulated with other objects, temporalities, and spatialities, often legacy versions when drawing on non-proximate disciplines. All this sounds like an unholy mess if one wants to produce a consistent long-term database of biodiversity relevant information the world over. At the very least, it suggests that global panopticons are not the way to go on biodiversity data. I've always liked this quote from Bowker, and I'm sorry I'm reading the whole thing out, but like when you put up text, you generally shouldn't read it. I like, this comes at the end of his chapter talking about these grand efforts to try to database the world, to try to get all of the world's information into something computable so we can save the world. And this comes at the end of the chapter as a very gentle admonition or saying, maybe this is not the best way to go about this. And I've always liked it because I think he does a nice job of critiquing them while not othering them while still respecting the work that they're doing, which I think is a hard thing to do when you're talking about a field that's not your own. But I think both the taxonomy case and the natural history collections case do a nice job of further illustrating why it's important to get away from these panoptical dreams, these dreams of cataloging and databasing the world and therefore having control over it. In some ways, both this project of like building the tree of life and just building a giant database are examples of two grand projets. They're two things that are more symbolic than they are functional. And they are also two things that have a little bit of common with trying to get a one ring to rule them all, basically. It's about controlling it through observation as opposed to actually doing the work with it and using it as something to query. I think that in talking through the actual working taxonomists, we could, instead of thinking about trying to build a panopticon, we could still consider building possible worlds and looking at these individual taxonomies as representing one possible view of the world. One thing that has struck me in working with taxonomists is that they're all extremely aware that every single taxonomy, classification, description that they create is a hypothesis. It's not a fact about the world necessarily, it's their interpretation of the data, and they're putting it forward with their expertise, but they understand that somebody might disagree with them at some point. Sharing the data in a computable way is as much to make it easier for people to reuse and have a conversation with them through the data as it is about trying to make it reproducible or refuting attacks or something like that. They're incredibly aware that, that these are hypotheses. Yeah, it's taxonomies rather than just taxonomy. So one thing I'm interested in and want to keep talking to these folks about is what's the risk of centering this existing plurality? So there are some actual risks. I have screenshots here that I don't think I have time to go into. I should probably leave 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we actually only have like 7 minutes left. So
oh gosh, okay,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah. No
yeah, but there's all sorts of amateur paleontologists out there that are putting forward their theories of how things are together, and some of whom actually can become pretty adversarial to working taxonomists. Some are fun. I highly encourage you to check out the Treeosaur website when you have a little bit of time. It's a guy who thinks T-Rexes evolved to use trees as like blinds as you do in hunting. It's great. So there is some gatekeeping to keep like stuff out that is not useful to what they're doing. But I think that centering the existing plurality of the field could be really productive. Same thing with databases. One thing that we're seeing in the Natural History Museum cases is that people need a true information ecology and they need to make their own decisions about the sorts of tools that they're using. There are not risks to, I do not see that there are that many risks to supporting this except to the administrators that often want to maintain IT control over a lot of these systems. So yeah, so I think my concluding thoughts here, supporting these pluralities and possible worlds is important for making the data accessible and useful, and thinking about how to support the coexistence of potentially conflicting worldviews could be important to better understand the social dynamics of different factions of science and non-science, whether they're differing factions of taxonomists or people who are trying to reject scientific claims outright. So I'm not trying to say that we're gonna like magically convince climate change deniers or anti-vaxxers to the scientific cause by being more explicit about the possible worlds that we already have in our work. But I think it's important to instead just explore how we could reframe scientific findings as part of that ongoing conversation as opposed to like immutable truth. And as possibly like a way of building up trust between research and non-research communities. Yeah, one thing I'm really interested in going forward, how do we make non-researchers comfortable with the social construction of knowledge as it's kind of being exemplified in some of these cases here, rather than trying to hide that social construction of knowledge or leaving it as something that's strictly the domain of humanists and STS scholars? How do we get that more out into the public? It's something that both the taxonomists and the Natural History Museum curators are quite comfortable with. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Okay, a couple of points for summary, but in general, thank you so much. I appreciate being invited here. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wish you were in a room full of people and we could all applaud you. And hopefully someday we'll meet up in person and we can do that. I'm seeing that we have one question in the Q&A, which I'll just read to you to kick us off. And I want to encourage everybody to put questions in the Q&A button that you see on the bottom of the screen. So this question is from Elliot Stevens. As you research and design databases, how do you consider accessibility and universal design? Is accessibility testing a part of the design process?
It very much is not, from what I can tell, at least for this community. And it's not because they don't see it as important. It's because they don't have resources. Like if I were just talking about the case study, I could have gone more into this, but a lot of those databases, they were built back in the 70s and 80s, and it's very ad hoc. It's people teaching themselves relational systems as they go. So I'm sure that they would be, my sense is that people are very interested in that, but it is often not something that is considered in these systems. And possibly just because, yeah, they don't have the time or background in it, yeah.
I would love to ask a question. Yeah, so I was really interested in your discussions around deep time. And I guess, so I'm curious about how the sort of the sort of conceptions of time, whether, what happens when competing conceptions of time come into contact with each other, if that makes sense, or different conceptions of time come into contact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, so that's been one of the biggest, like, I don't know how to describe it. I want to say blow ups, but I'm not sure if that's quite right. But that's one of the biggest schisms in like, so when this idea of deep time, like when Hutton coined this, and it really became something massively important through like geology going forward, it caused huge conflicts between the church and scientific institutions.
Right.
So a lot of people took it as evidence that there was no God, which, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be the case, but like it was seen as a threat to the church and their control over knowledge and the ability to say what is and is not true. And honestly, there's still a lot of conflicts around this. So, I mean, I know that there's still a lot of people, basically young Earth creationists who continue to argue that the world is 6,000 years old. And so it's less like different conceptions of what is time, more different conception of where time is coming from. And what does that time represent, I think. So, and I think it's actually, I'm very interested in what gets somebody in one side or the other. Like, how do you become, because people do switch from young Earth creationist to geologist and vice versa. So there's some interesting, there's social forces around it, more so than rational in a lot of cases, so.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I mean, at some point we can have a later conversation.
Yeah.
But I'm also interested in just thinking about how, for example, you know, people who are working with a legacy system think about the sort of timefulness in their work versus people who are like, we need to move to a different system. So I'm noticing it's 5, but you have a great question from Charlotte.
I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm not going anywhere. So.
Okay. So Charlotte Lee had a great question. Could you talk more about your thoughts about being proactive when it comes to infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Because so one thing with the IMLS project, I really do want to try to come up with some like actionable best practices for people that are working on these sorts of things. And part of that's because it's IMLS and they are very concerned with like, how do we actually support working information professionals? But I do think it's really important. So a lot of it is about trying to take that long view for planning for your institution and budgeting in time to do migrations, starting to try to project like, how long is this hardware actually going to last? How long is this software actually going to last? And thinking about what it would take to migrate something if it doesn't last, and doing risk assessment around how sustainable and open a lot of these systems are. In the current round of interviews that I'm doing as part of the Migrating Research Data Collections project, we started talking to a lot of archivists who are migrating to different collections management software. And one of the questions that we're asking is, have you thought about what you're going to do when you need to get your data out of this system? And we realized that we had to start rephrasing that because they were often quite scandalized and irritated at us asking about this, because they had, for one group, they'd all just finished migrating and none of them wanted to think about it right then. So I think one practical thing is just to think about, and that's part of what I'm hoping my research can start to show is how often do people actually have to migrate their systems? Because once we have that information, then you could start planning for it a little bit more intentionally. so that's one approach to it. I'm also happy to email other ones. Yeah. And I hope that answers, yeah.
Other questions?
I had kind of a related question in that I'm interested in maybe hearing you unpack a little bit about what you mean by reactive change and how you arrived at the distinction between proactive and reactive, because on the one hand, you're talking about, you know, the changes to these infrastructures needing to be functional and responsive to the actual needs of the users, which in a way is reacting to their needs. And so can you talk a little bit more about what is, like, how you drew that normative distinction between what's bad to be reacting against versus good to be proactively thinking about?
And I might rephrase how I'm phrasing those sorts of things. But so with the reactive change, I'm seeing it more as change that they didn't want to happen. They didn't plan for it, and they didn't want to have it to happen. And in some ways, it's an emergency response. It's because something that they didn't want to break wound up breaking, or they were forced into it through some other sort of organizational like force, basically. So yeah, and I don't mean it to. So yeah, I think you're like some reactive change is necessary and good. So I think that's helpful to think through to avoid, like, you know, lambasting people for making normal adjustments as opposed to being psychic and anticipating everything that they might need to do. So.
Do we have time for more questions? Because I have one.
We're over time, but if Andrea's okay with hanging out.
Yeah, I'm totally fine. Yeah.
Okay,
thanks.
and for folks on the call, if you know, we understand if you want to drop off, but if you're enjoying hearing Andrea answer questions, feel free to hang out.
So thanks for the talk. It was great. It was great to see the talk version. I read the semantic refactoring paper. And I have a question about that. So I want to know, from the perspective of scientists, what do you think is at stake in semantic refactoring? And specifically, I'm kind of asking, like, the categories that scientists use to parse time or organisms, they're not obviously arbitrary for them, right? Like, they're very loaded terms, they're very significant. I think you even called them a hypothesis, and they're like a hypothesis of what they think the world is, right? Like, like, do we parse the entities this way, or do we parse the time that way? Usually it has to do with, like, we think something really important happened at this time moment, or this is an important distinction between animals. And so when you're refactoring, you know, like, what happens there? And it's not like I use the word apple, you use the word manzana, but we're referring to the same thing. They actually, like, the words cut the world up in different ways, and there's something a lot at stake for scientists. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that element of the refactoring.
Yeah. Like, at the most baseline level, yes, they are hypothesizing about how the world is, but they are still publishing scientists and who do need to get tenure and keep their jobs and things like that. And so at a fundamental level, it's their reputation and their trustworthiness as a member of the scholarly community that's at stake. So it's both showing that they have a novel view of the world, and that has come out of their research and their interpretations, but also kind of asserting that it's, like, better than the ones that have come before, and and also demonstrating that they're capable of working within this community while still doing novel contributions. And so that's the part of making sure that things are linking together, because still working within that framework but doing new work. At a broader level, like, the idea behind building these taxonomies is that they are important for other kinds of science. So taxonomy itself as a discipline often defends itself as saying that we are foundational to doing a lot of other kind of research in medicine and biology. I'm not as well prepared to defend that claim, unfortunately, but that's there is a lot of talk with the taxonomists about how we need to be able to continue showing that this work is important and relevant, and that you can't do other kinds of work without it, because it's not like, if you think about, like, the H index or something like that, like citation rate of taxonomic publications, it's much lower than in a lot of other fields, and it takes much longer for them to be cited. So in a lot of these normal metrics of like, are you being a productive scholar, they don't wind up looking all that great sometimes because it's just a slower moving discipline in a lot of ways. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay, let's call it. Thank you, everybody, so
Awesome.
much for attending. Please be in touch with David, Anissa, James, and I for more information on the Data Then and Now series. We have another talk in 2 weeks, so look for announcements on that. And thank you so much to Andrea for doing
Thank you.
this talk in a highly unusual
Andrea.
format. We really appreciate it. We wish
this
you
was
were
fun.
here in Seattle with us, and that we're all together, but hopefully soon.
Yeah.
All right, thanks so much.
It was great to see you all.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone.